Hello, everyone, and good day, and welcome to, or good evening if you're listening to this in the evening time. This is episode 8 of the WayFinder podcast, and today I'll be talking of global society as a whole. It's not really societal health, but given sort of what happened with the coronavirus and the spread of that pandemic, it's worth keeping in mind that our social affiliation at the global level really can affect our health. People died. Hundreds of thousands of people died all over the globe from a virus that began in China, and again because we're so interconnected and we've become such a tightly woven global society, and we need to start thinking bigger picture really when we consider what healthcare really means. And so in this one, I'm going to dive into sort of social affiliations on the global scale and what should really guide that. And so before I begin, a poem just to sort of ground our minds and to get us in the mood. This one is called "The Second Coming" by Yeats, and it's one that I hearken to a lot when I think sort of the world at large, because it really helps us understand that the way we, and it was written by Yeats actually in the wake of World War I, and that was a time where the world went crazy for a period of time. World War II too was collective insanity. It's crazy, and the Cold War too was another form of collective insanity. And global it'd be nice to get to a point of global conflict where we're also in opposition, because every nation, and that's what I'll delve into here, every nation has their way of doing things, and that's great. Every sovereign nation has their way of doing things. However, sometimes we're going to bump up against each other because we trade with each other, we communicate with each other, we live in the world together. Even Paris Accords, right? For Paris Accords to work, we have to do it together in unison, right? And so we need to understand that no more collective insanity. There may be little spats every once in a while, but we should be able to fight against each other or agree with each other on terms that are less than war. Because if you think of World War I, World War II as well, even Vietnam and Korea and those Cold War situations, whole generations were scarred and whole generations were wiped off the map, and it's quite absurd. We should never get to that point again as a society. And this is me sort of putting my thoughts out there to speaking to my generation and generations to come as to how we can avoid that. Anyways, this is Second Coming by Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Wow, that's a powerful one. And like I said, it was written in the wake of a great war. Okay, so now let's really dive into it. This is not going to be too much of a long one because social issues are really hard to dissect. They're best talked about in a group setting in a discussion, and it's just me, so I'm just going to throw out my ideas out there. And if you have any comments and any feedback, please reach out. Okay, this first slide is sort of the structure of global society as I see it. So this is what it looks like. This is it. It's sovereign nations at a table talking to each other. Every nation that has any nation with a constitution is a sovereign nation, and every nation that doesn't know how to back that up by law enforcement and their military ceases to be less of a sovereign nation. Once your laws become defunct, that's a sign of a failed state. Anyway, the circle table that we sit at is called culture. At this table, we acknowledge that although we may have different levels of development, all societies within this black box of being ethical are equal. Ethics, the tie that binds society together is not just laws and sort of military, but the ethics and rigor that we apply with each other. And the laws and the still sort of military and sort of global law enforcement really becomes important when ethics and rigor are violated. And by ethics, I really just mean the state of play. How do you interact with other nations? For example, the United States has been very unethical in the past, and right now we're on the verge of being unethical again. But and by unethical, I mean sometimes we've waged wars in foreign. So, for example, the biggest one being sort of the reason why we went into the war in the Middle East, right? So the evidence was shoddy at best. At worst, it was downright criminal. and and we shouldn't get into wars for unethical reasons again. And because Colin Powell, he had a good record, right, on to the point where he lied about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. So that's the thing, right? So the United States itself has been unethical, and once we violate that, we sort of lose our standing as a leader in the globe. Anyways, as such, the fall of societies and even our global unity, it's not inevitable. It doesn't have to happen. It happens because we forget that what keeps us together is our ethics. And Anna Rand wrote about this quite a bit. Even Albert Camus and Simone Weil, and they wrote really post World War II time. And I think people who wrote in that time, right? People who experienced the horror that was World War I, World War II, and even the Cold War really understood. The ones who were grounded in their times understood that ideology and ideology at some is base level logic. It's not really deep logic. Deep logic is when Camus says that you and I may be different, we may be strangers, but we have a shared humanity. That's deep logic. Deep logic is acknowledging our shared humanity. Shallow logic is looking at our cosmetics and our aesthetics and sort of the way that your language, my language, sort of the way you like to run your nation, the way I like to run my nation, and see that as sort of what separates us out, right? Deep logic, on the other hand, deep logos understands that we humans share shared ancestor and we share shared even origins. But then what separates us, right? So what separated the Allies and the Axis in World War II wasn't the fact that they had different versions of ways of running their countries. It was because a madman and another series of madmen decided that they were going to separate humanity based on grounds of race and religion, right? That's what separated the Allies from the Axis, right? And as such, that's one war that I can look at. So I take a lot of my cues on analyzing world history from World War II and even the American Civil War, because those were wars, and that's I take my cue on wars from those two wars because those wars were just, right? There hardly ever any few just wars in humanity, because sometimes, like the Cold War, right? The Cold War wasn't a just war, and I'm glad the Cold War. So the Cold War was mostly cold because there wasn't any. It was mostly two political economic systems sort of rivaling each other, and it became hot every once in a while. So Vietnam was hot, right? And by that I mean there was actual combat and blood was shed in Vietnam, Korea. But again, I'm okay with a Cold War right now, and I think that's what we're in. Right? It's time, and I'm going to explore this further in the next sort of image. But we're in a Cold War situation where we were doing trade wars with other nations, the chief one being China and the United States right now, and I'm really going to explore that. But Cold Wars are fine. Cold Wars are fine when two sort of systems sort of um, try to, for lack of a better word, share their gospel truth around the globe, and we see which one the other nations sort of back behind. And given the situation of the Cold War, and given a few things I'm reading about now, sort of this democratic capitalism seems to be en vogue, right? It seems to be what won the great war of communism versus capitalism. But now even the two great nations of this current time, USA and China, they're both capitalist systems, but one is having a more communist capitalism and one has a more liberal capitalism. And now we're in a new era of Cold War, and I need to really understand what China is up to, and that's what I'm going to explore in the next slide. Anyways, at the cultural table that we're all sitting at, the importance really increases as we go. Like I said previously, right? The reasons why the Allies and the Axis divided along the lines they did wasn't because we shared the same language or we shared the same sort of aesthetics or logic. It's because we share the value for human life. And so, as such, the importance increases as we go out. So, ethics being most important, rigor being most important, and then deep logic being more important, and then logic, and then aesthetics and cosmetics. But unfortunately, I think we live in a time where aesthetics and cosmetics are really playing the most important part, right? Like even the president who got elected for in the American Union, and even Brexit and things like that. I feel like they while they have some deep reasons for being important, they sort of emerged out of sort of cosmetic reasons, right? Of divisive reasons, right? And again, just to point out the reason why I see this structure is that we have our ethics and our rigor really to protect our, because again, most of the quote unquote fun things in life are the artificial things, right? I enjoy fun and entertainment as much as the next person, right? But and that's really what life that's where a lot of the quote unquote joy and fun in life comes from, is the cosmetic and the aesthetic things and sort of the shallow logical things, right? But I mean, like the fact that I can share a fun, lovely conversation, in a cafe with my neighbor. That's sort of shallow logic, and those are the things that we live for, in my opinion, right? But to protect those things, right? We need to have ethics at the table, right? So logic, aesthetics, cosmetics are what we're really trying to protect with our ethics and our rigor and our laws and our steel. By steel, I mean military might, and that's only a worst case scenario, and we never want to get there, right? And that's it. So I'm going to explore my our relationship with China on the next slide, because I don't want us to get to a point where we as the American Union go into instead of fisticuffs with China, because that would take us, that sort of seems to be the new conflict that's brewing, right? Russia is the paper tiger, and China is the real force, right? And we don't want to get to a point where we're at such enmity with China that the guns come out, right? So we need to talk, right? And so I need to know if China has ethics that lets us be able to talk to them. And just to preempt, on the surface, it doesn't seem like given American history that we share similar ethics. Anyways, so yeah. But the thing is that the value of laws, though, and having sort of rigid laws, is that if you break laws and you get caught, you get to deal with the steel, right? An example of this is sort of the leaders in the Arab Spring, right? So the big example is Assad. Assad was poisoning his people with chemical weapons, right? We don't need more of a justification to get into a conflict with a nation like that, beyond the fact that they're killing their own citizens, right? And people may argue that America is killing its own citizens by not having healthcare and things like that. And that's worth considering. But and Camus and I agree with this a lot. So Camus' whole take on international involvement is that he tried to reason through it from what he calls the absurd. So the absurd is this state of being where we say, the final point of the absurd is that life as such matters, right? So if a person can claim that their life matters, then the life of the other person across from them matters. And as such, to take action in a society from that point of view, you have to do it for a belief that's beyond just the cosmetics of life, meaning that human life as such should matter. And as such, if Assad or any sort of other despot decides to kill their citizens, that's enough reason for another nation to say, okay, well, this shouldn't occur, and we should act on it. And furthermore, maybe that's what should even drive our own intranational policies too, is to go, okay, I may not agree with you, Democrat. I may not agree with you, Republican. But if your policy is helping life as such, then I'm willing to get behind it, right? And that's something worth thinking about. Anyways, unfortunately, on the global, and that's the thing. Unfortunately, on the global level, there are no international laws that are backed by international steel anymore. There's no global army. There's the global police. There's the IMF. But I mean, they don't really have much jurisdiction. They don't really have much power. So and that's really the importance of organizations like NATO and the UN, is that to prevent any sort of large scale war, we need nations, we need united powers to be able to act in unison against against forces that we think are destructive to human life. That's why Geneva was signed. That's why the NATO existed. But what we're seeing is for better or worse, the United States took on a lot of that burden, and now we're seeing a recoil from that. And that's the thing. The United States maybe should take a step back, but we shouldn't leave these unions entirely, because if we do so, we open up room for the despots, right? And there are many despots around the world. So although people might argue that the United States is a failed state because of a lot of the things that happen here, I fail to agree, because again, I have a two-eyed perspective. I'm an immigrant, but also an American citizen, and by being an immigrant, I know that this isn't a failed state. I know it's not a failed state because people can still speak back to the government. When people cease to have the right to speak back, then America becomes a failed state. America is not a failed state because it allows for conversation. It allows for the good fight, and the good fight is the fight that says, fisticuffs are not going to come onto the table until you violate ethics. And again, the world stage, though, we need to get back to the point where we understand that we can disagree as sovereign nations. However, the one thing that we should all seek to, because that's what Geneva was made for. Geneva was made for saying, we are going to do our things as sovereign nations. However, the one thing that we're going to protect is life. And once you cross that line, once you start to chemically attack your people, once you start to commit crimes against humanity against your people, once you start doing things like genocide or annexing Crimea and starting wars over petty things, then you've violated human law, which is ethics. You've crossed the line, and as such, you're crossing the line towards the banality of evil, and that's where we will step in. Anyways, and that's just sort of my sort of understanding of how I think global society should be organized. And now let's explore this more specifically with China. So the way I see it is that as a sovereign nation, you get to choose who your allies are, who your adversaries. And by adversaries, I don't mean enemies in the war. I just mean that who do you see your competitors as? Because companies, countries, they measure them how their success in employment level, unemployment level, GDP, things like that. Happiness, inequality, Gini coefficient, things like that. So you want people to come to your nation. You want immigrants to be able to come to your nation, or you want your citizens to stay in your nation and help develop it. And as such, you're competing with other nations for resources, and the resources of our time are really human capital and human labor, right? Those are the chief things. Like natural resources are becoming less to combat, and we're really nations are really in a flux of, okay, where do people want to live and work more? And China is really exceeding the United States in productivity level, and now the question becomes, okay, well, does the next crop of generations should they learn Chinese and find a way to in fact make themselves valuable to the Chinese economy? And that's the thing. So is China best seen as an ally to the global order, or are they indifferent, just making money and doing their thing, or are they adversaries? And I would like to answer this question, and this is something I'm going to explore for the rest of the year in my own personal readings, because China has become less than a paper tiger. China has become, because China has the second largest economy, and it's the second largest and the fastest growing, and that means that means that people will want to live there, and the cost of living there is low at the moment, right? Which means that they have a driving force. Again, if you think about it in chemistry sort of views, that they are or even sort of any sort of or complex systems, right? So if you look at China and the United States as two attractors instead of the global landscape. So let's think about it this way. Every nation is an attractor in the landscape of the national system, of the global system. Every nation is an attractor basin. China is the biggest attractor basin in the east, and America is the biggest attractor basin in the west. Now, what we're seeing is these two attractor basins sort of going towards the same area, right? So the thing is that will China usurp the United States and take its place in the global order, or will the United States sort of diverge from China based on certain reasons? And I think they will diverge, because on the surface, the question as to whether China should be our largest trade partner in the long term is no. The chief reasons that compared to the United States, they have a steep income inequality, but for being the richest nation in the world there, and the income inequality is far steeper, right? And but the thing is that it doesn't matter as much yet, because the quality of the cost of living there is low, so it's not as big as an issue, but it's bound to become one in the future. Another thing is that they're being very sort of dominate. They're being highly sort of they're highly dominating Hong Kong and Taiwan for reasons of sort of ownership, right? They're being a bully. And I mean, so people can say the United States is also being a bully, but for unethical reasons, right? They want to own Hong Kong and Taiwan, and these are peoples who are wanting to be independent, right? So I think that reeks of empire, right? So again, the United States is a soft empire. It spans most of North America, and it's a big landmass, and it has a lot of money, and it has a lot of influence, and lots of embassies and bases. But it's a soft empire now. It's slowly recoiling on itself, right? And that's okay. But China seems to want to be a strong empire in that sense, and that's not so good. And finally, the real reason why I think that they're more in the adversary camp, which means that although they have monetary attractors like the USA has, they have unethical attractors. So they have very, very strict restrictions on the individual and the family. They're persecuting Christians by trying to regulate their fate, and they have a policy on how many children your family can have, and they have a social valuation system. These three reasons enough, in my opinion, are big enough to separate them from the United States. The United States, for what it's worth, is a liberal capitalism, and China is a communist capitalism, which means that They care about what you do in your social life. America, sure, they monitor things and people say, "Oh, I don't want the NSA to know what I'm doing," but it's like they don't. It doesn't really affect your day to day life. But in China, if you go to China, your day to day life affects you standing in the community in a sort of arbitrary sort of, they decide what good and bad is, right? The state determines what good and bad is, and that affects your paycheck, sort of your community life. And yes, in America it does, but on a very local level, right? So if I'm an asshole to my neighbor, then my neighborhood knows me as an asshole. But again, I can just leave and go try somewhere else, or I can do business. They'll still do business with me, right? But they'll just know that I'm an asshole, and they may never invite me to the party. But in China, if you're an asshole, this social validation system changes how you're seen to the marketplace, and that's very, very destructive. And as such, I think in the long term, these two attractor nodes, although they're coming to us together because on a very shallow level of money making and capitalism, they're going to diverge. So for now, I'm going to put China in the adversary's camp because we share two fundamental different social ethics systems, and as such, we're bound to differ. All right, finally, just going to talk about briefly about these international organizations. So, international cooperation is fantastic and it's good to do things on a scale of like the Paris Accords and things like that. You need global cooperation, but the issue is that these organizations are not effective because they have no teeth. By that I mean, they rely on the United States and other G8 and G12 nations, or G7, or any of this global organizations to really back them up, right? So if and the allied nations and NATO and this things, like, they don't really have a force unless these nations back them up. And the issue with that though is that these things are so separate from home that they're easily corrupted. FIFA is on here, and FIFA is a highly corrupt organization. The IOC that does the Olympics is highly corrupt. And the UN, I don't know much about it, but I'm not surprised that any sort of bureaucracy that's far separated from the actual constituencies is going to be corrupt, right? And as such, how do we reimagine these organizations? I think the best way to do it is to really have nations and their leaders, and that's why when Trump talks his bravado talk about stepping back NATO and stepping back from the UN, I understand why he's saying it because this organization has ceased to be effective. But what he should do, right? Speaking as a citizen and a citizen in the global ecosystem, he should take a leadership role. Like he should send in ambassadors to places and leaders into these places where we can actually quote unquote drain the swamp there. And we should take leadership roles. We shouldn't step back and say, okay, it's done, it's corrupt. We don't want to have anything to do with it because there's going to be situations like, for example, the coronavirus, right? This is the WHO has ceased to be effective too, but this is a case where the WHO is backed up effectively by nations, and nations can go, okay, there's this thing we're monitoring. Okay, this is how you all should get ready for it, and we have a global response system, and that's it. These organizations there should be a council of leaders that act in unison to global threats such as viruses and the state of the oceans and the ozone, right? They should be our global response system. We need global response system. And this is my solution. As such, the nations in them should have very strict criteria for membership. And they should be willing to kick out the nations that don't live up to the ethics of the organizations. Right? They should be willing, for example, Iran and North Korea are in the UN still, and the WHO has organizations participating, for example, African nations with despots ruling them, right? And as such, the leaders, Donald Trump, Theresa May when she was still, and Boris Johnson now, these people should take leadership. Macron, they should take leadership roles, and they should be able to kick nations out. This cohort of the UN and NATO. This should be strong groups with tied with binds of ethics, right? And they should be able to say, okay, we're going to monitor nations that are despotic, and when they change their tune, we'll bring them into the fold. But nations in the fold should live by the ethical standards. And yeah, and so finally, I just suggest that the nations within in this greater global union, they should clean house, and then if that's not sufficient enough, they should do embargoes against the nations that are not living up to ethical standards, and they should only trade with nations within the ethical union, right? Imagine if and it's not an effective short-term solution because in the short term we want to trade with everybody because we want to get stuff now. But if we're able to suffer the short-term burden of scarcity, but for the long-term gain of sort of ethical standards, if we can move the world towards more ethics, then maybe the other nations in the world will be incentivized to clean up their act, right? So if you, and this is sort of on a personal level, that's how I'm going to try and live, is that I'm going to only live my real deep interactions, right? And I'm going to build bridges with people I think are ethical. And in the short term, it means I'm going to lose a lot of friends and a lot of companions, right? But in the long term, it means people who are attracted to me will be people who I build bridges with will be on solid ethical grounds, and that's what I'm proposing to the nations in this UN and the other unions. Kick out the unethical nations. In the short term, suffer the losses and trade with the ones who are ethical. And in the long term, maybe we can build a better world. And anyways, that's the societal one. Hope you enjoyed and look forward to talking to you soon.